This 10-minute video examines the concept of integrative potential in constructive deliberation, which occurs in the dialectic part of the conceptual framework. So, what is dialectic discourse? Well, dialectic discourse differs from dialogue in that judgment is re-engaged, but it's similar in that the critical analysis is neutral in its intentions, focused on validity through reasoned argument without constraint by one's preconceived positions on an issue. Such an open-minded discussion may affirm an assertion, refute it, or reveal new possibilities. And how is this useful in the search for integrative potential? Well, we constructively manage the tension of opposing ideas, and instead of choosing one at the expense of the other, generate a creative resolution of the tension in the form of a new idea that contains elements of each of the opposing ideas, but is superior to either alone. Now, if both parties can do what they need to do on their own, they should just get on with it. But when we cannot fully achieve what we want on our own because we are interdependent with others, the dialectic approach to discourse can help us to integrate our interests and find the best path forward for everyone. If we don't, we may be immobilized by the conflict between our desires. These desires involve both positions and interests. In conflict, people often have very specific desires, and they're often easy to identify because disputing people are quite explicit about what they want. What they want is their position. When strongly held positions are at odds with each other, it creates a conflict that becomes a competition. But stated positions are just the visible part of the proverbial iceberg. There is also an underlying outcome that reflects the needs, concerns, hopes, or fears of each party, which the position is intended to achieve. The interests that are the reason for the position. To get beyond argument over positions, it helps to explore each party's underlying interests and how they may overlap. It is rare that a particular position is the only way to achieve these underlying interests. So, if you can understand them, it may be possible to find alternative ways to address them, if not completely, at least sufficiently, for everyone to feel heard and respected in the process, and thus to find a solution which can be successfully enacted and sustained. The alternative is to just deal with the positions, which leads to competition, power conflicts, and resultant resentment without resolving the underlying reasons for the positions themselves. Conflict approached through authority or competition, no matter how legitimate, civil, or well-intended the process may be, leaves the underlying issues unresolved, which not only means the issue is bound to resurface, but can also damage relationships and thus impair our ability to deal with future issues. So how do we go about understanding these interests? Well, that's a matter of open-minded inquiry, which requires effective communication, the subject of the first video in this series. But in addition to effective communication, we need to be able to manage our behavior, which requires understanding our conflict style. The dual concerns model of conflict styles is borrowed from sources that are cited in the toolkit file titled Dual Concerns Model. This model uses a grid with two axes, one based on whether we are passive or assertive in pursuing our own interests, and the other based on whether we are dismissive of or empathetic towards others' interests. I won't go into the details of the model in this video, and refer you instead to the toolkit, but simply note that compromise is the most common approach to negotiation. Unfortunately, when people know this is how the negotiation is going to work, they tend to take extreme opening positions and spend a lot of time maneuvering rather than trying to find solutions that address the legitimate, even if conflicting interests of both parties. In education, As in most negotiations, we are interdependent. We live and work together, and we succeed or fail together. Unless we can find mutually satisfactory ways to address the root causes of our conflicts, we will be doomed to a vicious cycle of competition over perennially contentious issues that ruins relationships and never actually resolves anything. Thus, the constructive deliberation approach advocates a collaborative attempt to satisfy both our own interests and others' interests to the maximum extent possible by looking for creative responses rather than a zero-sum process of trade-offs. We may have to fall back on compromise for issues that we cannot resolve, but a vigorous, good faith attempt to actually find common ground and resolve the root cause of our differences should come first. So, this brings me back to the conceptual framework. If we begin our deliberation with a dialogue in which we seek to understand others' perspectives, hopes, and needs, so that we can develop a common analytic frame consisting of what we know and can agree on, what we do not know but should perhaps try to learn, and where we are liable to disagree and why, then we are prepared for the search for ways to integrate our interests. Ideally, that might resolve all the differences, but probably there will be some issues that just cannot be resolved at the current time. To prepare for a decision, we then enter into a final phase of respectful debate, in which we fully explain our reasoning in relation to these issues so that the final decision is at least fully informed. But eventually, a decision must be made. That, however, is not the end of it. A decision is just an idea until it's put into practice. And that process is just as complex as the decision-making process that precedes it. This is the subject of the final video in this series. Before we conclude this video, however, let's consider some of the common yabbits that arise. An integrative approach to creative problem solving is generally not the current norm in formal negotiations, and often not even in our personal decision-making on a day-to-day basis in the school. Why not? Well, we might think it's a good idea in theory, but not really practical. Particularly if the other party is competitive and positional, we may think we have to meet that approach with an equally hard approach. Fight fire with fire, if you will. At both the provincial and local level, I'm sure you have seen examples of how that works out, both in terms of the short-term wisdom of decisions and success in the actual implementation of those decisions, as well as in the long-term effect on relationships, culture, and system health. Another common concern arises in formal negotiations when the issues at hand are predominantly economic. If it's not possible to increase the available budget, how creative can you be? Applying an integrative approach to these issues can be difficult, but it's still helpful. With an agreement on appropriate data, the parties may be able to move past staked out positions to consider how to use the available resources most effectively. At a minimum, the attempt to do so indicates good faith and thus minimizes resentment and damage to relationships when it's not possible to satisfy every desire. Another concern is the amount of time required. Well, there's no magical solution to this ever-present challenge, but it must be said that haste makes waste, and there is no advantage to rapid negotiation that results in a poor outcome that creates even more problems. If we don't get to root causes and find ways to integrate interests in our dealings with others, our decisions will be weaker, harder to implement, and harder to sustain. So that's an overview of the concept of integrative potential. The PDF files in the toolkit provide more granular detail and are suitable for personal exploration or group discussion of this topic. And don't forget the final video in this series, which discusses implementation, or what we prefer to call enactment of a decision.